Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of my we're all completely fucked crime expose. Not we're, as in me putting on the, maybe we'll put on the funky glasses, fuck it. Can't really see properly in these things anyway. Yeah, like I'm not a fucking criminal. I might be a bit. I used to sell some drugs when I was younger, but the less I said about that, the better, really. Only weed anyway, just, made quite a lot of money, but like I was a fucking teenager, I'm fucking nearly 40 now. Don't think that's a big deal. Some of the deals I did were pretty big, but I'm like a crystal welding hippie now. This is what my currency. I've got lapis lazuli. This one is a great pocket stand. If you want to get yourself one of these, you'll find that your intellect and your psychic clarity will infuse, and you just can't beat a bit of quartz as a handstone. You can feel it, Got a mate who used to just say, why don't you just go and get some gravel? Just keep that in your hand and meditate with it, just a fucking inanimate object. Huge amounts of potential energy though in a quartz. Huge amounts of potential energy. Let me just make sure I'm on flight mode. Wait there. Let me go. There we go. Let's make sure there's no anything bad. Anyway, I'll read you this other document, part 2, and I won't get any interruptions this time, hopefully. It's entitled Navigating Endemic State Criminality, Structural Methodologies for Whistleblower Protection, Evidentiary Corroboration and International Accountability. Executive overview of the captured state paradigm. The intersection of absolute state power and transnational organised crime presents an extraordinary jurisprudential, operational and structural challenge. In a theoretical dystopian scenario where the foundational apparatus of sovereign democracy, specifically encompassing the public sector, the civil service, the security services, even the National Health Service and the geographic and specialised police forces become systematically complicit in severe criminality, traditional mechanisms for justice are functionally nullified. When this criminality encompasses extraordinary rendition, coordinated human trafficking and high-value sovereign fraud, it engenders an environment of pervasive institutional capture. In such a paradigm, the conventional methodology of asking the perpetrators to investigate themselves constitutes both a logical absurdity and a fatal operational risk for any witnesses or whistleblower. The purpose of this extensive structural analysis is to rigorously evaluate the mechanisms available to an isolated individual armed exclusively with a telephone, an internet connection, and a highly indicative but predominantly circumstantial evidence. So you might not, have something of substance, a pair of spunky boxer shorts or a HD video, but it can just be stuff that kind of implies, what's going on, circumstantial evidence. So to impose endemic state complicity while ensuring their own survival and primary protection of abducted victims. This analysis systematically deconstructs the futility of utilising domestic reporting mechanisms, the severe limitations and potential weaponisation of intergovernmental bodies such as the International Criminal Police Force, Interpol, and the fallacy of relying on the North American Treaty Organization, NATO, for internal rights interventions of people who believe breaching internal human rights or the Human Rights Act. Furthermore, the analysis conducts an exhaustive legal review of the proposition to utilise private military contractors to gather evidence from domestic or public sector officers by forces necessary, contrasting this with the legally viable and highly potent methodology of open source intelligence, OSINT. We'll cover that extensively in this video. Do keep your ears open and take notes with a pen and paper if you've got one handy right now, or just watch and pause the video again like some kind of crazed YouTube fanatic. Finally, the report outlines the precise supranational architecture, specifically United Nations procedures and deployment of extraterritorial universal jurisdiction and transnational investigative journalism consortiums that must be leveraged to bypass a captured state and enforce international accountability. The structure Structural futility of domestic law enforcement and civil remedies. In any functioning legal ecosystem, the primary mechanism for reporting serious organised crime, official corruption, or human rights lies within the domestic law enforcement architecture. So in the United Kingdom, this architecture is extensive, comprising 44 geographic police forces across England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, alongside specialised entities such as the British Transport Police, MOD Police and Civil Nuclear Constabulary. At the apex of this structure sits the NCA, not a great organisation, don't do much, and the Serious Fraud Office, who I don't know much about, I'm going to be honest, but the NCA specifically houses the International Corruption Unit, which is ostensibly tasked with investigating international bribery, corruption, laundering of illicitly acquired state assets, etc. Additionally, the domestic security apparatus relies on heavily public intelligence gathered. I'll just wait for this alarm to stop. Wait there. So yeah, additionally, the domestic security apparatus heavily relies on public intelligence gathering, primarily through the UK anti-terrorism hotline. You can phone this number, which funnels tips directly into MI5 and counter-terrorism policing network. The paradox of state-directed reporting. However, when the foundational hypothesis postulates that these precise agencies of the civil service structures that oversee them are the architects of the crime being reported, domestic reporting mechanisms immediately transform from avenues of justice into intelligence gathering traps for the perpetrators. Reporting state-sponsored human trafficking, the sequestering of vast amounts of public funds, or extraordinary rendition to a compromised police force like the NCA or the SFO guarantees the immediate exposure of the whistleblower. The Serious Fraud Office, despite its remit to tackle the most serious and complex cases of fraud or bribery, operates under political and institutional constraints that render it notoriously ineffectual when investigating the very state machinery that dictates its funding and operational directives. Submitting a dossier of circumstantial evidence regarding high-value state fraud to the Serious Fraud Office via standard channels actually just merely alerts the complicit actors to the existence of a leak triggering an internal purge rather than a legitimate criminal investigation. Similarly, utilising the counter-terrorism hotline to report state-directed abductions provides the security services with the exact location and identity of the dissenting citizen, neutralising the threat they pose to the criminal enterprise. So you say like, yo, it's me making this report, and they're like, yeah, we know about what's happening and we now know who the fuck you are. Whistleblower protection frameworks in the UK primarily are governed by what's called the Private Interest Disclosure Act, PIDA. The wholly inadequate, and they are wholly inadequate for this magnitude of systemic corruption. The PIDA protects workers from retaliation when making a protected disclosure to their employer or a prescribed person. So it's like trade unions and local government kind of vibes. However, PIDA contains profound structural laws. It lacks a centralised whistleblower office, does not mandate companies to implement whistleblower mechanisms. It places the burden of proof on the employee and, crucially, offers zero physical protection against a state apparatus willing to engage in extraordinary rendition. In a captured state scenario, in employment law protectors are entirely irrelevant against perpetrators wielding coercive power of the state. The illusion of private prosecution, recognising the complicity of the police and the Serious Fraud Office, a theoretical legal bypass within the UK system, is private prosecution under section 6.1 of the Prosecution and of Offences Act 1985. God, fucking dry mouth again. Any private individual, victim or organisation retains the statutory right to institute and conduct criminal proceedings. In theory, this mechanism was historically designed as a vital constitutional safeguard. I'm sure I had a cup of coffee. What have I done with it? Wait there. I left it on my PC. I had a cup of fucking coffee. I just made a coffee. Where were we? The illusion of private protection. Recognising the complicity of the police and the SFO a theoretical legal bypass within the UK system is the private prosecution. Yeah, we read that bit. The mechanism was historically designed as a vital constitutional safeguard against the exact scenario which this document is hypothetically claiming: the inertia, partiality, or corruption of state prosecuting authorities. Despite its theoretical utility, a private prosecution against a captured state apparatus is fundamentally unviable and highly dangerous. The statutory framework contains a fatal vulnerability that a complicit state will immediately exploit under Section 6.2 of the Protection from Offences Act 1985. Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, possesses the absolute and unchallengeable power to take over a private prosecution at any stage of the proceedings. Once the Crown Prosecution Service commandeers the private prosecution, it can arbitrarily discontinue the proceedings by claiming the case fails the full code test. You can Google that. CPS can assert that the prosecution is not in the public interest, or that it interferes with another fictitious state investigation. They can just trump up something random, or that the circumstantial evidence which the state itself may have deliberately suppressed or obfuscated is insufficient for a realistic prospect of conviction. Therefore, initiating a domestic private prosecution merely serves to legally signal the whistleblower's intentions, resulting in the immediate confiscation of their evidence and probably the termination of the legal challenge and the exposure of the whistleblower to retaliatory state action. So search orders and the compromised judiciary, another domestic civil instrument often utilised in severe commercial fraud, is the search order, formerly known as the Anton Pillar Order. This is an extraordinary and highly invasive civil remedy granted by a court to prevent the imminent destruction of crucial evidence, permitting the applicant's legal representatives to enter a respondent's premises to search for, image and seize electronic and physical material. To obtain an Anton Pillar order, the applicant must demonstrate to a judge that they have an exceptionally strong prima facie case. What prima facie is, then Google that too. That the potential damage is very serious, and that there is clear evidence the respondent possesses incriminating documents which they are likely to destroy. Because the element of surprise is paramount, these applications are made ex parte. That means without notice to the respondent. Good if they did that for all the Latin, wouldn't it? While highly effective in standard corporate litigation, deploying an Anton Pillar order against a complicit state is a functional impossibility. Firstly, if the judiciary or a broader civil service administration is infiltrated by the conspiracy, seeking such an order exposes the whistleblower's evidentiary hand directly to the compromised infrastructure. Secondly, a civil search order executed against a highly secure public sector office, like an NHS data centre, for example, or security service installations, would immediately invoke state security laws, so national security exemptions, and the Official Secrets Act. The state would not comply. Instead, it would arrest the applicant and their legal team under the guise of protecting classified national security infrastructure. So you've got like a function here. You've got columns of domestic mechanism, their intended function, and the vulnerability in a captured state scenario. So you went to the NCA. What they're supposed to do is investigate international corruption or high value fraud, but the vulnerability in a captured state scenario is that the NCA is controlled by the state, acts as an intelligence trap for the whistleblower. Then you've got the counter-terrorism hotline, right? They gather public intelligence on immediate threats, alerts complicit security services to the whistleblower's identity and location. So you're just saying, come and fuck me. Private prosecution, POA 9085 section 6, should function to allow citizens to prosecute when the state refuses. But the DPP can illegally hijack and terminate the prosecution at any time, as we've already covered a little bit. And search orders under the Anton Pillar law should function as a civil seizure of evidence to prevent destruction. Actually, it's impossible to execute against secure state facilities, and tips off the judiciary about who's grassing them up. Here's a problem with Interpol, right? You used to be able to phone Interpol, but you can't anymore. They've got like a data capture thing on their website, but they don't have a phone number, you know, and you can't phone before the NCA was created, there was something called Serious Organised Crime Agency, SOCA, and they ended in 2013 and it turned into the NCA. And since then, they've just been nicking people's drugs and generally sort of trying to stop people coming in small boats. That's all I see on their Facebook, like on their Insta profile. Given the total collapse of domestic avenues, the immediate and logical escalation for a concerned witness to seek the intervention of international law enforcement, predominantly the International Criminal Police Organisation Interpol, facilitates a global police cooperation across 196 member countries, theoretically providing a supranational mechanism to counteract transnational organised crime, human trafficking and serious financial fraud. However, a rigorous structural analysis of Interpol's operational framework reveals that it's uniquely ill-equipped to receive direct whistleblowing against a sovereign member state. Interpol is strictly an intergovernmental organisation. It's a massive communications and database framework, not a supranational investigative body with independent enforcement powers or autonomous detectives. So you've got the National Central Bureau bottleneck. So this is the fatal flaw in utilising Interpol's portal for this specific dystopian scenario, lies in its strict data routine architecture. So the organisation operates exclusively through designated national bureaus, NCBs, located in each member state. In the United Kingdom, Interpol NCB is located in Manchester and it's structurally integrated directly into the National Crime Agency, the exact domestic body the whistleblower must avoid. The rules governing the processing of data within Interpol information system explicitly mandate that access, data submission and requests for international cooperation are mediated entirely through the NCB or expressly authorised national entities. Private citizen cannot bypass that NCB to report a crime directly to Interpol, General Secretariat in Lyon. Any attempt by a UK citizen to contact Interpol regarding UK state crimes via an online portal or an email would just be systematically and automatically routed back to the UK NCB, which is basically the NCA themselves, for verification, translation and action. And this bureaucratic loop instantly alerts the complicit state actors to the whistleblower's identity and the intelligence they possess, entirely defeating the purpose of international help. The weaponisation of Interpol via transnational repression. Far from being a safe haven, Interpol's mechanisms are frequently weaponised against whistleblowers and dissidents. Authoritarian regimes and corrupt state apparatuses routinely misuse Interpol's notice systems, particularly red notice and diffusion, as instruments of transnational repression. That's even got its own acronym, transnational repression. That says a lot, doesn't it? By disguising political motives, the silencing of witnesses or the suppression of whistleblowers as legitimate criminal investigations, a comprised UK state could easily issue an international alert against a citizen attempting to expose them. So diffusions are particularly dangerous in this context. Unlike red notices, which undergo a degree of centralised legal review by the General Secretariat prior to formal publication, diffusions can be determined directly by the originating NCB, which is the UK NCA, to the foreign police agencies of their choosing, with virtually no prior legal oversight by Interpol themselves. So if the whistleblower attempts to flee jurisdiction to ensure their safety, the complicit state could use a diffusion to trigger their arrest under the broad fabricated charges of grand theft, corporate fraud, terrorism, or violation of the Official Secrets Act. Interpol actively encourages member states to transmit diffusions to rapidly secure arrests. The Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files exists to ensure data processing complies with Interpol's constitution, particularly Article 3, which strictly forbids the organisation from undertaking any intervention or activities of a political, military, religious or racial character. However, the CCF is an independent oversight body for data rights, not a criminal investigative unit. While a whistleblower could theoretically appeal to the CCF to delete fraudulent red notice issued against them, CCF can't investigate the underlying state crimes, such as the extraordinary rendition or, for example, NHS fraud that the whistleblower is attempting to expose. The CCF confines its assessment purely to data compliance. It doesn't protect witnesses or launch inquiries into member states. So again, the Interpol mechanism, its operational function, and I know I never read these tables, I can't get it to move, there we go, and the viability for a whistleblower exposing a member state. So the first bit says here, so the first column, Interpol mechanism, National Central Bureau, NCB. What that's supposed to do is act as a sole liaison between domestic police and Interpol. But what the viability for a whistleblower exposing somebody who works for the state or is funded by the state is zero. The NCB is operated by the complicit state, which is the NCA. I'm not accusing the NCA of anything here, or anybody, you know, I'm just looking at crime and enforcement and the futility of anybody tackling institutional abuse, you know. Direct citizen reporting. The operational function of direct citizen report, Interpol rules do not permit direct crime reporting by individuals to the General Secretariat. So you just can't go and say, like, look, this is happening, the police tried to kill me, or like the NHS raped my fucking daughter, you know. These things probably aren't going on. I'm not suggesting they are. I'm just saying, you know, that you can't tell Interpol if the British state or the state of any country in fucking Europe is abusing you or has hurt you or has infringed on your civil liberties, you know. The viability for a whistleblower exposing a member state under that row is zero. Sorry, I had to stop there for someone I thought was going to do my obs, but was actually just going to the cloakroom. Yes, the citizens have no direct operational access to the database, so, you know, there's nothing they can do now. There's a column here about red notices or diffusions. Normally, they function in this column used to locate and provisionally arrest individuals pending extradition. Negative, highly likely to be weaponised against the whistleblower by the complicit state. Then you've got another mechanism, the Interpol structure, which is futile, is the CCF, which stands for Commission for Control of Files. Usually that should review data compliance and individual requests for data deletion. Viability for a whistleblower exposing a member state, very low. Can only protect the whistleblower's data rights retroactively and can't investigate the state. What about private military contractors then? What if one wants to say, right, I'm just going to go get Blackwater and XE to come in with a fucking helicopter and a whole load of fully automatic weapons and save the hostages held in the building? In the hypothetical situation, private military contractors and the legal impossibility of kinetic evidence extraction. Basically, they'd be called a bunch of crooks if you did do that and you had the means to. So, recognising the closure of domestic and intergovernmental law enforcement channels, the query proposes the high extreme deployment of private military contractors or private intelligence networks to forcefully gather evidence from British domestic public sector offices by forces necessary. The intention is to corroborate the circumstantial material by physically extracting the concrete evidence the state is hiding. This approach requires a rigorous examination of both domestic UK law and international legal frameworks regarding private security and mercenaryism, whatever that is. I'm heavily medicated on haloperidol and haloperidol and clonazepam and lamotrigine and various other tablets. The delusion of domestic private military contractor operations. The deployment of private contractors to gather evidence by forces necessary from public sector offices is fundamentally illegal, operationally catastrophic, and legally suicide for the whistleblower. There is a profound distinction between the regulation of private military contractors operating in international armed conflicts, such as the Middle East or Africa, and private security operating within a sovereign, peaceful domestic jurisdiction like the United Kingdom. In international conflict zones, private military contractors operate under complex and often ambiguous jurisdictional frameworks, such as the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act, MEJA, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, and voluntary intentional guidelines like the Montreux document and the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers. Even in these environments, the use of lethal force is strictly limited to inherent self-defence or the defence of others. They do not possess the legal right to conduct offensive raids or evidence extraction. In the United Kingdom, private investigators, security operatives and corporate intelligence firms possess absolutely no greater legal authority. So there's really no way you can turn the police powers of or immunity than an ordinary private citizen. Their activities are strictly bound by a dense matrix of domestic legislation, primarily the Private Security Industry Act 2001, which mandates security industry and authority SIA licensing, and the Data Protection Act, of course, incorporating GDPR, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000, RIPA, and of course the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. Private investigators are explicitly and strictly prohibited from hacking computers, wiretapping, intercepting communications without state authorization, trespassing on private or government property, or impersonating law enforcement officers. Under the Human Rights Act, specifically Article 8, it constitutes intrusive surveillance and must be proportionate, strictly necessary, and lawful. So any attempt by a private intelligence agency or a hired PMC to physically breach a public sector office or an NHS facility or a police precinct, or to use force necessary to extract documents, would result in the immediate criminal prosecution of both the contractors and the whistleblower who hired them. I mean, they might get it right, they might get the evidence, upload it and then get arrested. I mean, who knows? It's not like, I wouldn't rule it out, but it's basically whoever ordered it, they're going to follow the money, and that guy's probably going to be at risk, but c'est la vie. Any attempt by private military entity or hired PMC to physically breach a public sector office to extract documents would result in the immediate criminal prosecution of both the whistleblower and the contractors and the whistleblower who hired them. Charges would undoubtedly include aggravated burglary, trespass, assault, computer misuse, and severe violations of the Official Secrets Act. Furthermore, from an evidential standpoint, the strategy is self-defeating. Under UK law, evidence obtained through illegal means such as physical trespassing, passing, unauthorised hacking or intimidation is highly vulnerable to being ruled inadmissible in any legitimate judicial proceeding. Utilising such kinetic or illegal methods would instantly discredit the whistleblower, shifting the legal and media focus entirely away from the state's organised crime and onto the whistleblower's utilisation of legal mercenary tactics. The state would seize the moral and legal high ground, framing the whistleblower as a domestic terrorist or a hostile state proxy. You know what, I'm a little bit cold. I'm just going to grab a sweater to put on. This one is actually a very special one to me. You can only see it in the small image. It's all made out of hemp, made by Dip and Doze. It's a nice hemp jumper, and it's really comfy, it's really stretchy. It makes me feel good when I wear it. I'm going to get lots of organic hemp clothes one day. There we go. Back in the game, nice and warm. Wearing my glasses. Should we go for, let's get the cap and the ridiculous glasses back on. Robert Downey Jr. style. There we go. Much better. Furthermore, from an evidentiary standpoint, the strategy is self-defeating. Under UK law, evidence obtained through illegal means such as physical trespassing, unauthorised hacking or intimidation is highly vulnerable to being ruled inadmissible in any legitimate judicial proceeding. Utilising such kinetic or illegal methods would instantly discredit the whistleblower, shifting the legal and media focus entirely away from the state's organised crime and onto the whistleblower's utilisation of illegal mercenary tactics. This state would seize the moral and legal high ground, framing the whistleblower as a domestic terrorist or a hostile state proxy. The legitimate alternative, advanced open source intelligence. This is where you want to go, basically. So rather than resorting to illegal kinetic extraction, the optimal and legally pristine strategy for a whistleblower armed only with an internet connection is the sophisticated application of open source intelligence. Open source intelligence has emerged over the last decade as a premier methodology for exposing state-sanctioned human trafficking, extraordinary rendition, and complex financial fraud. It involves the legal examination, continuous monitoring, collection, and forensic analysis of data. It's openly available but requires specialised skill to locate and verify. For a whistleblower holding a vast amount of indicative and ambiguous circumstantial material, OSINT is the precise mechanism by which this ambiguous data is corroborated and synthesized into a legally actionable dossier. In cases of extraordinary rendition and state abduction, OSINT methodologies include the analysis of ADS-B flight tracking data correlating the hidden movements of state-chartered aircraft with the geographical disappearance of victims. In cases of state-sponsored human trafficking, OSINT investigators do not need to raid border force officers. Instead, they monitor deep web forums, public social media recruitment networks, obscure corporate registries, and geolocation data to map the logical supply chains used by this complicit actors. For complex fraud involving the SFO or the civil service, OSINT relies on cross-referencing global corporate registrars. Anything leaked to data sets such as Panama Papers or Cyber Confidential, for example, mapping third-party due diligence records and scrutinising public procurement databases to identify the illicit sequestration of vast sums of money. By aggregating perfectly intersecting circumstantial evidence through entirely legal frameworks, the whistleblower transforms isolated, ambiguous data points into a comprehensive, undeniable web of structural state corruption, all without violating single domestic trespass or anti-hacking statute. So the framework provides vast tool sets for this exact purpose, categorized to allow investigators to safely probe public records without leaving a digital footprint on the servers. I'm not going to read you the table, I can't be arsed. Synthesizing circumstantial evidence for international tribunals. The central concern of the hypothetical is that the whistleblower possesses very little corroborating evidence, but a vast amount of extremely indicative and ambiguous circumstantial material which correlates with perfect acuity. There is a misconception that international investigations require a smoking gun, such as signed confession or a video recording of a state abduction. I'm going to blow my nose and be gross, I've just woken up, sorry. In the realm of complex state corruption and severe human rights abuses, data evidence is deliberately destroyed, classified, or suppressed by the state, as you might expect. Consequently, international investigatory standards such as the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime Practical Guide on Investigation of Corruption Cases explicitly recognise the fundamental necessity and validity of circumstantial evidence. An investigation theory must be flexible and built upon the aggregation of fragmented information. The International Arbitration and Criminal Tribunal circumstantial evidence that corroborates a broader narrative is heavily relied upon. While direct evidence constitutes video or audio recordings, circumstantial evidence includes the conduct of the parties, contemporaneous documentary anomalies, the deliberate disabling of tracking systems, the rapid destruction of public records, unusual payment terms to shell companies, and the systemic failure of state bodies like the Serious Fraud Office or the police to investigate glaring anomalies. When vast amount of circumstantial evidence intersects with perfect acuity, it collectively satisfies the burden of proof required to trigger a supranational inquiry, shifting the burden onto the state to explain the statistical impossibility of so many intersecting anomalies. Digital self-preservation and operational security. So before transmitting this particularly gathered intel and circumstantial evidence to any international body, the paramount concern is the physical and digital survivor of the whistleblower. A state apparatus complicit in extraordinary rendition and high-level fraud possesses vast, virtually unlimited signals, intelligence and cyber surveillance capabilities managed by the entities akin to GCHQ. Enforcing investigations into the British state with only a telephone and internet connection requires flawless military-grade operational security. So standard communications architectures including SMS, traditional email, Gmail or Outlook, and standard cellular voice calls are trivially intercepted by state security services. Yes, it does say voice calls there. Via lawful interception mandates or clandestine mass surveillance. To maintain integrity and safety, the whistleblower must entirely abandon standard telecommunications and exclusively employ cryptographic and anonymizing technologies designed specifically to thwart state surveillance. So the Tor network, the Onion router, Tor is a free overlay network that utilizes onion routing to conceal a user's intellectual property address or IP address, and that doesn't stand for intellectual property. It's Internet Protocol, I think, address and physical location. It achieves this by encrypting the traffic and routing it through thousands of random volunteer-operated relays worldwide before it reaches the public internet. Tor makes traffic analysis and network surveillance by state actors exceptionally difficult, allowing the whistleblower to research operational intelligence, monitor the state, and access reporting portals with a high degree of anonymity. Then you've got the end-to-end encryption, E2EE. All communications with journalists, international lawyers, or human rights NGOs must occur over strictly audited 2EE protocols. The premier standard is Signal. Signal encrypts text, voice calls, and metadata by default, ensuring that even if the state intercepts the data packets traveling the internet, they mathematically cannot decrypt the content without the physical device. The importance of EE2EE is underscored by the ongoing legislative battles such as the UK's Online Safety Bill, which privacy advocates warn contains provisions that could actually undermine encryption and create a regime of mass surveillance. The whistleblower must assume all non-E2EE channels are compromised. Secure drop. When the time comes to transfer the vast amount of circumstantial documentary evidence and OSINT dossiers, standard email attachments or commercial cloud storage are entirely inadequate. The whistleblower should utilize secure drop. This is a Tor-based open source submission system utilized by major journalistic organizations such as The Guardian, The Washington Post, and ProPublica to receive sensitive documents anonymously. Secure drop shields the source's identity from both the receiving journalists and intercepting state surveillance. Virtual private networks, again, we all know what a VPN is, as an added layer of obfuscation before connecting to the Tor network. Get yourself a good VPN. Need to utilize the mask the user's initial connection from their location, so the feds don't come, or the NCA or the Vatican Masonic Knights or whatever, preventing the state from identifying that the user is even accessing anonymity tools. Bypassing the state, United Nations special procedures. Having secured the circumstantial evidence via OSINT and established a secure digital parameter, the whistleblower must transmit the intelligence to an entity possessing international legal authority, total immunity from UK state interference, and crucially, a mandate that does not require the prior exhaustion of domestic remedies. The United Nations Rights Council special procedures perfectly fulfill these criteria. So the special procedures consist of independent human rights experts appointed as special rapporteurs, independent experts and working groups mandated to report, advise, and intervene on human rights issues from a thematic or country-specific perspective globally. Crucially, unlike the European Court of Human Rights or various international treaty bodies which demand that a citizen fight their way through the domestic courts, first invoking the UN special procedures does not require the exhaustion of domestic legal remedies. This is an absolute operational imperative for the whistleblower, as attempting to exhaust domestic remedies would mean engaging directly with the captured UK police, the SFO, and the compromised judiciary. So mechanisms applicable to the hypothetical crime. So the severe crimes hypothesised, extraordinary rendition, systemic human trafficking, and the subsequent cover-up fall directly under the preview of several specific UN mandates. The first one is the working group of enforced or involuntary disappearance. In cases of extraordinary rendition, secret detention, or state-sponsored abduction, this acts as a vital channel of communication between the families of disappeared persons and governments. It possesses a highly potent urgent action procedure, reserved for cases reported within 3 months of the disappearance. In these instances, This bypasses standard bureaucracy and transmits the case directly to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's where you need to go, through the most rapid means possible, demanding an investigation and accountability. The Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, this mandate focuses exclusively on the human rights aspects of victims' trafficking. Special Rapporteur takes direct action on violations committed against trafficked persons and intervenes in situations where the state has systematically failed to protect their rights. The submission process and the establishment of a public record. The whistleblower, acting either individually or in secure collaboration with an international non-governmental organisation, can submit a detailed complaint directly to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights via secure email, encrypted fax, or their online submission tool. This submission requires detailed information regarding the incidents, the identity of the victims and alleged state perpetrators, and the circumstantial evidence linking the events. When the Special Rapporteur or the WGEID determines that allegations and the circumstantial dossier are credible, they issue formal communications directly to the state. While these communications are initially kept confidential for a brief period, typically 60 days, to allow the state to respond, they are subsequently made entirely publicly available on the public communications site and included in the annual report submitted to the UN Human Rights Council. The mechanism is strategically devastating to a corrupt state. It completely bypasses the UK's domestic law enforcement apparatus, denying the state the ability to silently confiscate the evidence. By establishing an undeniable public international record of the state's complicity at the highest diplomatic levels, it renders covert suppression by the domestic security services impossible and forces the state to answer to an international community. The role of Greta in trafficking, not Greta Thunberg, different acronym. In parallel with UN mechanisms for issues specifically relating to human trafficking, the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings, Greta, monitors the implementation of the Convention on Action against Human Trafficking in Human Beings. Greta regularly graduates the UK's compliance. Reports from NGOs to Greta frequently highlight the catastrophic failure of domestic UK systems, such as the lack of secure reporting mechanisms for migrant workers, where sharing data between police and immigration enforcement prevents victims from coming forward. By transmitting the operational intelligence dossier to Greta during their evaluation rounds, the whistleblower ensures the state's complicity is structurally documented in binding European treaty compliance or reports, further tightening the diplomatic noose around the complicit state actor without ever involving domestic police. Extraterritorial accountability, deploying universal jurisdiction. While the United Nations and Greta can investigate, expose and publicly condemn, they lack an international police force to physically apprehend the perpetrators or freeze the sequestered fund. To achieve genuine criminal accountability and custodial sentences for state actors involved in extraordinary rendition, torture or trafficking, the whistleblower must look to the legal doctrine of universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is the powerful legal principle that certain crimes under international law, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, enforced disappearance and torture, are so universally heinous that any sovereign state possesses an interest in and the legal right to prosecute the perpetrators, regardless of where the crime occurred, the nationality of the victims, or the nationality of the perpetrators. It's the ultimate antidote to a captured state. The UK's domestic strangulation of universal jurisdiction. So the UK possesses universal jurisdiction legislation covering acts of torture, hostage taking and grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. In a purely theoretical sense, a private individual can apply to a Westminster magistrates court for an arrest warrant against a visiting foreign torturer. However, recognising the profound diplomatic risks and the potential for these laws to be turned inwards, the UK government structurally neutered this capability. By amending the law via the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Act, the government has ensured that the consent of the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, is an absolute prerequisite before an arrest warrant can be issued in universal jurisdiction cases brought by individuals. So it gets a bit complex here. In a scenario where the UK state is the perpetrator, applying for a domestic universal jurisdiction warrant against a complicit UK official or civil servant is entirely futile. The compromised DPP will simply deny consent, citing a lack of evidence or public interest. You can look at that up on universaljurisdiction.gov.uk and that one there. Triggering universal jurisdiction in third-party states. So to circumvent this domestic blockade, the whistleblower must weaponise universal jurisdiction in third-party foreign jurisdictions. So several European nations maintain exceptionally robust and active universal jurisdiction frameworks, free from the political constraints of the UK DPP. France, Germany and Spain are at the forefront of this legal practice. France, for example, maintains a complex but highly aggressive universal jurisdiction framework for crimes of torture and enforced disappearances. The very definition of extraordinary rendition, French courts possess total jurisdiction the moment a suspect is physically present on French territory, regardless of whether torture occurred. The strategic methodology of the whistleblower is therefore one of surveillance and patience, utilising Operation OSINT. The whistleblower maps the travel patterns of the complicit UK officials, civil servants or security service personnel when a senior officer involved in the state-directed trafficking or rendition network travels to Paris, Frankfurt or Madrid for a diplomatic summit on a personal holiday. The whistleblower, operating securely through established international human rights NGOs and like Redress or Trial International, files a comprehensive criminal complaint with the French or German federal prosecuting authorities. I mean, I don't know when these guys are going to go to Germany. How would you find out? I don't know, but you can just wait in France, Germany or Spain. If you happen to see like a bent social worker who's in nonce, then yeah, I mean, I don't know any myself, but if you did, hypothetically, apparently that's the way to do things. Seems a bit nominal in statistics and probability to me, but the foreign state then arrests the UK official, entirely bypassing the protection of the British state. Piercing sovereign immunity, the Belhage precedent, the primary defence universally utilised by state actors accused of extraterritorial crimes is state immunity, or the foreign act of state doctrine. They argue that one sovereign state cannot sit in judgment over the sovereign acts of another. However, international and domestic jurisprudence firmly establishes that courts are increasingly willing to pierce this veil when fundamental human rights are violated. The landmark UK Supreme Court case provides the definitive, incontrovertible precedent for dismantling state protection. Some dude, Abdul Hakim Belhage, and his wife Fatima Bouchar sued the UK government, former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw and the intelligence officers, alleging UK officials were directly complicit in their abduction in Bangkok, their extraordinary rendition and their subsequent severe torture in Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. The UK government aggressively attempted to have the case dismissed before it even began, arguing that under the doctrines of sovereign immunity and the forced acts of state, domestic courts were legally forbidden from ruling on the legality of acts involving foreign sovereigns and clandestine intelligence operations. The Supreme Court fundamentally and unanimously rejected the government's defence. The court ruled that the doctrines of the state immunity and the foreign acts of state absolutely cannot be relied upon to escape civil claims of complicity in severe breaches of fundamental preemptory human rights such as torture and unlawful rendition. This monumental ruling confirms the state actors acting in an official capacity do not possess blanket immunity from civil or criminal liability when participating in international crimes. For the hypothetical whistleblower, the Belhage precedent is a structural roadmap. It proves that if circumstantial evidence can be rigorously compiled, as investigative journalists did regarding the flight logs and factors detailing the UK's involvement in Belhage's rendition in that case law, the legal firewalls of state immunity will collapse. It guarantees that state actors can be directly held accountable in open court, provided the evidence is routed through uncompromised legal channels. The fallacy of NATO intervention, like in the desperate search for international protectors with the power to compel a sovereign state, one might theorise that the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation could intervene. Article 2 of the North Atlantic Treaty explicitly states that parties will contribute to peaceful international relations by strengthening their free institutions, bringing about a better understanding of the principles of democracy, and promoting conditions of stability and well-being. However, relying on NATO to investigate a member state's internal corruption, fraud, or human rights abuses is a profound misinterpretation of international treaty law. NATO is fundamentally and exclusively a collective defence military alliance, architecturally underpinned by Article 5, collective defence against an external armed attack. While Article 2 contains aspirational normative language regarding democracy and the rule of law, NATO possesses absolutely no internal policing mandate, no investigative body for domestic state crimes, and no legal authority whatsoever to intervene in the human rights violations committed by a member state within its own sovereign borders. Pretty fucked up, really. The strict duty of military forces under NATO agreements is to respect the law of the receiving state and rigorously abstain from any political activity. Engaging NATO in a domestic whistleblowing scenario is functionally impossible, legally baseless, and a waste of the whistleblower's official resources. So the transnational journalism proxy, externalising the narrative. So when domestic law enforcement is entirely complicit, intergovernmental bodies are bottlenecked by national bureaucracies, and international legal mechanisms require significant time to mobilise. The most potent immediate weapon available to the whistleblower is transnational investigative journalism. If a whistleblower takes their circumstantial evidence to a single domestic UK newspaper, the state has numerous tools to suppress that story. The government can apply for super injunctions, issue D notices, which stands for Defence and Security Media Advisory Notice, and block publication on national security grounds, or utilise aggressive strategic lawsuits against public participation, fucking slap, designed to intimidate publishers, exhaust their financial resources, and silence reporting. However, the state cannot successfully injunct or suppress a decentralised global network of journalists operating simultaneously across dozens of foreign jurisdictions. Organisations such as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ, specialise in this exact methodology. The ICIJ operates cross borders, analysing massive, highly complex data sets such as the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, or the Cyprus confidential leaks, to explore offshore secrecy, state-level money laundering, and grand corruption. Furthermore, entities like the Whistleblowing International Network, the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and the Signals Network, write all of these down, please, exist specifically to provide structural, legal, and operational support to isolated individuals exposing massive public interest issues. These organisations connect whistleblowers with their legal aid that transcends domestic borders, ensuring their physical protection while the data is processed. By securely transmitting the compiled circumstantial dossier to a transnational consortium via secure drop, the whistleblower externalises the data. Once the evidence of state-sponsored rendition, trafficking, and fraud is simultaneously published in the New York Times, Le Monde, or Der Spiegel, or an El Pay, the UK state permanently loses the ability to suppress the narrative. The resultant geopolitical shockwave forces immediate diplomatic isolation, destroying the state's deniability and instantly triggering the very UN special procedures and universal jurisdiction investigations a corrupt apparatus sought to avoid. So, synthesis and strategic conclusion. The hypothesis of a deeply corrupted end-to-end state-level conspiracy involving the highest echelons of the UK public sector, the NHS, the police, and the security services, presents a scenario where conventional mechanisms for justice are synonymous with self-destruction. The NCA, the SFO, the anti-terrorism hotlines, and domestic private prosecutions are structurally compromised, serving only as mechanisms for the state to identify, isolate, and neutralise dissent. Similarly, intergovernmental bodies like Interpol are fatally tethered to the state's national central bureau, and NATO possesses no jurisdictional mandate to intervene in domestic affairs. To survive, protect abducted victims, and enforce accountability, the whistleblower must entirely abandon kinetic domestic avenues. The proposition of acquiring evidence through private military contractors or physical infiltration of public offices is legally fatal and strategically flawed, guaranteeing criminal prosecution and an inadmissibility of the evidence. So you can't just force their hand there. Instead, the whistleblower must harness the asymmetrical power of open source intelligence to weave their vast intersecting circumstantial evidence into a cohesive, mathematically undeniable matrix of state criminality, operating under draconian fail-safe digital security protocols, utilizing Tor, strict no-log VPN, Signal for end-to-end encryption and secure drop. This intelligence must be routed exclusively onward, bypassing the domestic state apparatus entirely. By deploying the synthesized data to transnational investigative journalism networks, the whistleblower shatters the state's monopoly on information and neutralizes domestic injunctions, concurrently submitting this corroborated intelligence to United Nations special procedures which critically require no exhaustion of domestic remedies, establishes a permanent, unassailable international legal record. Finally, by mapping the geographical movements of the perpetrators, which is basically impossible, the whistleblower and aligned international NGOs can trigger universal jurisdiction in proactive party nations, utilising established legal precedents to pierce the veil of sovereign immunity. In a totally captured state, justice is never found internally. It must be systematically engineered, legally fortified, and ruthlessly applied from the outside in. I've been Brodie McLeod. I still am and will be until the electrical activity in my heart and brain ceases. But until then, be it a naive sense of optimism, a benign belief in the patriotic free market designs of transnational organisations, or just the visceral compassion and guilt that I feel for my ineptitude, my ignorance and my various personal failings, I hope that you find peace and please help those who don't have a voice.